Welcome back, U.S. History 2 class. In this audio slideshow, we're going to take a look at the Progressive Era, roughly 1900 to 1916, the first 2 decades of the 20th century. This is a very crucial period in American history. The movement of the progressives really begins to grapple for the first time with the social problems brought about by that rapid industrialization of the Gilded Age. The progressive movement, or progressivism, definitely builds upon past reform efforts. The abolition movement, the women's movement, the long-standing movement to ban alcohol, for example. The progressives have very distinct goals. They want to decrease the influence of special interests on politics, particularly big business and the trusts. The robber barons that had basically controlled the economy and politics of the Gilded Age. They want an honest and responsive government. They want to clean up government corruption. They want to increase popular participation in government to give a voice back to the people. They want a stronger, more active federal government that steps in and regulates portions of the economy. They want a government that's responsible for the social welfare of citizens, and they reject the whole notion of social Darwinism that the survival of the fittest should guide government policies towards the poor and otherwise. Keep in mind that factions of both parties are progressives. There are progressive Democrats and there are progressive Republicans. There are also conservative factions in both political parties. So the progressive movement cuts across party politics in many ways, and coalitions of progressives cross party lines. In fact, there are examples of progressive presidents in this period that are both Republican and Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, who we'll talk about in a bit. The movement of the progressives, though, tends to be urban and northern. As we saw with the populist movement, that movement tended to be rural and southern and western. This progressive movement is squarely focused on the industrial core of the United States, and although it has elements that impact rural areas in the South and West, it tends to be overall urban and northern in its orientation. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the progressive era, the Industrial Revolution continues and in some ways gathers even more force. The economy grows enormously during this period. Industrial production increases. The population booms, both naturally and because of immigration from Europe. And for the last time, really, in American history, farms and cities begin to grow together. There's growing demand for food in cities that increases the demand for agricultural products, and agriculture enters a golden age during these first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Progressive Era. The consumer marketplace also continues to expand, as we saw in the previous 2 audio slideshows. The city, though, is the focus of progressivism and captures the imagination of much of society. The new mass consumer society that's growing there, and the number of cities in the U.S. with a population over 100,000 continues to grow. The inequalities, though, of urban life that had become apparent in the 1890s persist, with immigrants living in slums and the very wealthy living in isolated neighborhoods and luxurious mansions. Here you see one of the luxurious mansions in a city. There's a lot of consolidation that remains in the economy. J.P. Morgan's financial firm, for example, directly or indirectly controls 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the nation. More than a third of mining and factory workers live in poverty. The cities attract the writers and artists, and they're very dynamic and modern, and capture folks' imagination. The problems and social issues in the cities are really highlighted by a series of disasters. One of the worst is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911. It erupts on March 25th of 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in Greenwich Village, New York. It's a neighborhood in New York City. The employees there are mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, and they earn as little as $3 per week working sewing machines. A fire breaks out in the shop, which is on the top 3 floors of the building. The owners had actually locked the doors to stop theft and bathroom breaks, and the fire truck ladders only reached to the 6th floor. 46 women jump to their deaths, and 100 more perish inside from the fire. This basically shocks the nation and creates a great call for more oversight and more regulation of business practices towards their employees. Journalists begin to play an increasing role in the progressive period as social critics. A whole new generation of journalists begins to expose corporate greed, particularly in the cities. The cities are seen by some as a place of corporate greed that's eroding traditional American values. This new generation of journalists begins to write for mass circulation national magazines, and they try to expose the problems of industrial and urban existence. Teddy Roosevelt calls their approach muckraking in a very pejorative type of way. He doesn't mean that in a nice way. He means that they're just uncovering all the unsavory things in a society by raking through the muck with their investigations. And he doesn't find them helpful in that regard either. Lincoln Stephan is one of these muckraking journalists. He writes a series of articles for McClure's that are eventually published as a book called The Shame of the Cities. It exposes how party bosses and businessmen profited from political corruption. In the same magazine, McClure's, Ida Tarbell publishes articles that point out the arrogance and economic machinations of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Probably the most famous of these muckraking journalists and authors is Upton Sinclair. He writes a novel called The Jungle, which becomes a classic in American history. It describes the unsanitary slaughterhouses and the rotten meat that's being put into people's sausages. This book is pretty, if you ever need a push to become a vegetarian or something, this would be a book to read. It's pretty awful, the things that he exposes in the book, and it becomes a bestseller. Legend has it that when Teddy Roosevelt read it, he threw his sausages in the morning out the White House window. This book has an immediate impact on politics and leads to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, trying to clean up some of the abuses that Upton Sinclair had pointed out in The Jungle. Now, Upton Sinclair is a socialist, and The Jungle definitely has a socialist message to it. It involves a Lithuanian immigrant who works in some of these factories and exposes the exploitation and the horrible working conditions in some of the meatpacking industries of Chicago. The new immigrants continue to have a major impact on American society in the progressive period. The most characteristic of the early 20th century cities is the presence of the new immigrants. New immigration reaches its peak in the 1920s, and again mainly coming from southern and eastern Europe. Between 1901 and 1914, 13 million immigrants come to the United States, again mostly from Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time would include Poles and Czechs and Hungarians and dozens of other ethnic groups as well, all of which begin to migrate to the United States. This wave of migration is part of a global process of immigration that's caused by industrial growth and agricultural decline around the world. This map, which is also in your textbook, shows the major migration systems from 1815 to 1914. And notice the Atlantic one with millions moving to the United States. Many immigrants are involved in long-term labor contracts. They are enticed to immigrate to the United States by labor agents who provide the contract workers to American employers. Large numbers of Chinese, Mexican, and Italian immigrants in particular are bound to these long-term contracts. As we talked about in the previous audio slideshow, Ellis Island continues to be the major entry point on the East Coast for the immigrants from Europe. This is a picture of a typical immigrant family on their passenger liner, and all of the different ethnic groups that begin to arrive with the Statue of Liberty there in the center. By the way, a Magyar is just the name for that Hungarians have for themselves. The West Coast equivalent of Ellis Island is Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, and here is the major embarkation point of Japanese immigration. Remember that Chinese immigration, legal immigration from China, has been excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act, but Japanese immigration and immigration from other Asian countries continues in the American West through San Francisco. Japanese migration is considerable, but Mexican migration is much larger. Between 1900 and 1930, nearly 1 million Mexicans come to the United States, mostly through Texas, and many become cheap agricultural labor when they arrive. By 1910, 1 out of every 7 Americans is foreign-born, and much higher than that in some areas of cities. In New York City, for example, 76% of the population are immigrants and their children by 1920. And very high numbers in Chicago, Cleveland, and Boston as well. Many of the immigrants are on a quest for freedom and had come to America seeking that. Basically, America is seen as a land of opportunity, as a land free from repressive governments, which many of the European immigrants are fleeing, and a land where religion can be practiced as one wishes, and that there is religious toleration. Many of the immigrants, though, end up being birds of passage. They only come to America temporarily, earn money and remit it back to their home country, and then eventually return. Other immigrants take up permanent residence in the United States. Most of the new immigrants settle in ethnic neighborhoods. Here is an ethnic neighborhood map of Chicago around 1900. These ethnic neighborhoods help the immigrants to gradually accommodate and assimilate into American society. The native tongue or language is spoken, culture from the mother country is preserved in those ethnic neighborhoods. Here's a painting of a typical ethnic neighborhood in New York. And this is an early photo of one. Women have a very dramatic change in gender roles during the Progressive period. Women become newly visible in public places such as workplaces, entertainment, sites of entertainment, stores, etc. More and more women begin to work for wages in the Progressive era. We saw that with the unfortunate victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Many black and immigrant women in particular are still confined to low-paying, unskilled jobs. But women workers are no longer only young, unmarried white women and adult black women. Working women increasingly become symbols of female emancipation. This chart, which is also in your textbook, shows the percentage of women in the labor force increasing gradually from 1900 to 1930 to almost a quarter of the labor force. Women's occupations begin to change as well. Notice the decline in household work from 1900 to 1920, and the increase in clerical work for women during the same period. Women's role or occupation in manufacturing remains relatively flat during the period. These new working women are in many ways economically independent. They become symbols of female emancipation from men, and they begin to move beyond traditional roles as wives and mothers. Their desire to participate in the new mass consumer society causes many women, both native and immigrant, to earn money independently of their families. Sometimes that causes a lot of friction, especially in immigrant families. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a leader of the women's rights movement, claims that the road to women's freedom lies through the workplace and economic independence from men. Her call for that becomes increasingly influential. And again, that creates a family friction for many women, again, particularly from immigrant families. Some major developments occur in the Progressive period in manufacturing and industry as well. Fewer individuals are more wrapped up in the new consumer society than Henry Ford. Ford does not invent the automobile, but he does create production and marketing techniques that bring it within the reach of ordinary Americans. In 1905, he founds the Ford Motor Company, one of many small automobile manufacturers in the United States at that time. In 1908, he introduced the Model T, simple, light vehicle that was tough. It could stand up to the country's poor roads. And gradually he standardizes the output of this car. That causes lower and lower prices in order to bring what had previously been a luxury good within the reach of ordinary Americans. Prices begin to drop along with the mass production of the Model T, and the assembly line is one of the major reasons for that. In 1913, Ford opens a factory at Highland Park, Michigan, and adopts the moving assembly line, in which car frames are brought to workers on a continuously moving conveyor belt. The process greatly reduces the time it takes to produce an auto, and thus Ford was able to expand his output. In addition to this innovation with the assembly line, Ford began to pay his workers much more than the average employer at the time. He introduced a $5 a day plan in 1914. He raises the wages of his workers to an unheard of amount, $5 a day. That allows him to attract skilled workers. But again, assembly line work is monotonous, and Ford uses spies and armed detectives to prevent his employees from unionizing. Ford justifies this high wage by saying that workers need to be able to afford to buy the goods that they produce. And that brings a built-in market for the very products those workers on the assembly line are churning out. By 1916, Ford's Model Ts are affordable for many of his own workers as their prices continue to drop. The economic system based on mass production and mass consumption comes to be called Fordism at the time. This is the sale of passenger cars in the Progressive period. Notice the amazing increase in the 20-year period from 1900 to 1920. America's love affair with the automobile begins, and as we'll see, that fundamentally begins to transform American society. A mass consumption society is born. Cities are the real birthplace of this mass consumption society, and new meanings of American freedom begin to emerge. Only really in the Progressive era do large downtown department stores and chain stores in cities, retail mail order for rural residents, only then do a lot of the consumer goods become widely available and accessible that are produced in America's factories. Wages remain low. There's an unequal income distribution, and Southern poverty is again a limit on the extent of the consumer economy before World War I. But in the Progressive era, mass consumption becomes a cornerstone of American freedom, and it's understood as the abundance of goods offered by modern capitalism. The advertising industry really takes off and becomes crucial in building up and creating a demand for all of these new consumer goods. Here are some examples of advertising from the period for the new mass-produced sewing machine by Singer. The garment industry is changed by ready-made clothing. Previously, most garments had been home-sewn or tailored in shops. Now, clothing starts to be mass-produced with set sizes. Here is an early commercial from Kellogg for cornflakes. in baking powder, and so forth. Bathtubs, bathtubs and indoor plumbing, which had previously been something that only the rich could afford, gradually begin to move down the social scale to the middle class in the Progressive period, and increasingly to all classes of American society later. This cartoon shows the overabundance of advertising on some city streets and the crowding, bustling economy of the Progressive period. Leisure becomes increasingly important and is also part of mass consumption, with mass entertainment in amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters attracting large crowds. Vaudeville shows are particularly popular, and gradually, though, they're replaced by the new motion pictures that had increasingly become a mass phenomena. Working class moviegoers attend these at venues called Nickelodeons. As production shifts from capital goods like steel and railroad equipment to consumer products, that new advertising industry again perfects ways to increase sales. Sports become particularly popular, and baseball is the first to gain great popularity. The National League of Professional Baseball Clubs is founded in 1876, and the American League emerges in 1901. In 1903, the first World Series enshrines baseball as the national pastime. There's an early baseball team, I believe the Chicago team. Croquet is popular. Both men and women play that together, and the game sweeps the nation. The popularity of bicycling grows as well, especially after the invention of a safety bicycle with pneumatic wheels of identical size. Previous bikes had been those huge front wheel numbers that were pretty dangerous to ride. Football becomes a college sport at first, but there's a major scandal in 1905 when 18 players die from game-related injuries. This in turn leads to the founding of an organization that comes to be known as the NCAA, the National College Athletic Association, which is still basically around. It institutes reforms and new safety gear and helmets to help players. Basketball also emerges as an indoor sport and is popular with both men and women. Boxing and other sports engage all classes of society in the Progressive era. You definitely see the growth of mass entertainment in this period. Father John Ryan is a Catholic priest. He writes a book called A Living Wage in 1906. He suggests that a decent standard of living is a natural and absolute right of citizenship. And he calls for enough of a wage to have some leisure time and a decent shot at saving money. Demands for a living wage and a decent standard of living are definitely part of the promise of the Progressive era. And some predicted that want and scarcity were going to disappear, with capitalism providing growing abundance and leisure for all. Progressives want basically to humanize capitalism and redefine freedom in American society. They're They're afraid that American society is becoming increasingly fragmented by labor conflict and mass immigration. Some desire to return to a competitive marketplace of small producers. Other and most progressives accept the large corporation and look to the government to combat some of its abuses, the growing concentration of wealth, and to ensure certain practices of social justice. Other progressives locate freedom in the private sphere of personal fulfillment and self-expression. Nearly all progressives feel that freedom had to take on a new meaning to confront early 20th century social and economic realities. All kinds of workers during this period complain of a loss of freedom. Large auto, electrical, steel, and other companies seek greater and greater control over work processes. Frederick W. Taylor, in his system and method of scientific management, leads the way in this. This is a way of increasing production and profits by scientifically studying and controlling costs and work practices. And many skilled workers see this Taylorism as a loss of freedom. They're tied to a production quota and a time card, rather than working at their own pace and exercising their skill as they had done in previous periods. White-collar workers also complain of a loss of freedom. Salespeople, salaried professionals, corporate managers, they make higher incomes than most workers, but they also experience loss of freedom as they often end up working for others where once they would have owned their own business. These developments make industrial democracy and industrial freedom central to progressive language and demands. Many progressives, such as Louis Brandeis, see labor and unions as essential allies. And President Wilson eventually appoints Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court in 1916. Brandeis believes that unions are necessary to give workers a role in economic decision making, and not just wages and working conditions, but also managerial decisions such as layoffs and profit distribution. He imagines a different kind of welfare state, one rooted less in protecting workers than in ensuring universal economic entitlements, such as the right to a decent income. The progressives are challenged by a movement to their left, the socialist movement. Economic freedom is also the cry of this more radical movement that begins to emerge in America. It reaches its greatest influence in the progressive era. The Socialist Party is founded in 1901 and united late 19th century radicals such as populists and followers of Edward Bellamy, who we talked about last time, with parts of the labor movement. The party calls for immediate reforms, free college, laws to improve working conditions, democratic control over the economy, and public ownership of key industries like railroads and some factories. By 1912, the Socialist Party had 150,000 dues-paying members and publishes hundreds of newspapers all over the country. It had significant support in the American Federation of Labor, and it elects dozens of local officials. Socialism flourishes in immigrant communities in particular, such as among the Jews of the Lower East Side of New York, Germans in Milwaukee. It also gained support among farmers in old populous states like Oklahoma and, believe it or not, southeast Kansas. Also, mining regions in Idaho and Montana turned to socialism. Socialist communities again emerge all over the country. This map shows their concentration. Notice the concentration in southeast Kansas. Girard, Kansas is actually where the major National Socialist newspaper is printed for a time. Eugene Debs, who we encountered in the great Homestead strike, the Pullman strike back in the Gilded Age, unites all of these disparate factions into the Socialist Party. And socialism begins to gain strength in Europe as well, particularly in Germany, France, and Scandinavia. In 1912, as we'll see, Debs receives almost 1 million votes for President of the United States, and nearly 6% of the total votes. The socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason, which again is printed in Girard, Kansas, as you see from the masthead there, had the largest weekly circulation for a time of any newspaper in the United States. The AFL continues to grow during the progressive period, and there's continued labor strife illustrating the deep discontent that many workers have in the progressive era. AFL membership triples to 1.6 million between 1900 and 1904. Simultaneously, its leaders become closer to corporate leaders, and corporate leaders become more willing to deal with unions as a means to stabilize their labor relations. AFL President Samuel Gompers joined with large capitalists in the National Civic Federation, which accepted workers' rights to collectively bargain in so-called responsible unions. The NCF helps to settle hundreds of industrial disputes, and it helps to improve safety in the workplace and created pensions for long-term workers. Most employers, though, still remain adamantly opposed to unions. The AFL mostly represents America's privileged workers, skilled industrial and craft labor, mostly all white, male, and native born. In 1905, some unionists reject the AFL's kind of exclusionist approach and form a much more radical union, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW was both a union and a revolutionary organization, very similar to the Bolshevik Party in what eventually becomes the Soviet Union. It was dedicated to seizing the means of production, and was definitely influenced by Marxist political theory. It wanted to abolish the state. It makes solidarity of the working class its guiding principle. It tries to organize all workers excluded from the AFL, immigrant factory workers, migrant timber and agricultural workers, women, blacks, and even the Chinese. Mass strikes by immigrant workers become more and more common in the progressive period. William Big Bill Haywood is the major leader of the industrial workers of the world, who are often called wobblies. The mass strikes by immigrant workers placed workers' demands to collectively bargain with employers at the front of progressive reforms. The strikes showed that ethnic divisions might impede labor solidarity, but that ethnic cohesiveness among some groups could be a basis for unity if strikes are organized democratically. The IWW was often called to run these strikes, which often start spontaneously, and it insists that each ethnic group have representation on the strike committee. The uprising of the 20,000 in 1909 was a strike by garment workers in New York City, including some of the women who would later perish in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Another major strike occurs in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912. Men, women, and child workers went on strike against pay cuts. The IWW forges the strike into a united group. They survive militia and police attacks and win the strike on the union's terms. Another famous strike in the progressive period is the New Orleans dock workers strike. Black and white dock workers make an uncommon cross-racial alliance to resist pay cuts and attacks on their unions. Perhaps the most famous strike of the progressive era was the so-called Ludlow Massacre. The United Mine Workers strike against the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company for union recognition, wage increases, and an 8-hour day, and also the right to live and shop in places not owned by the company. The owners responded to the strike by evicting strikers from their houses. Armed militias surround a tent colony erected by the strikers, and they attack the tent city in 1914. They kill up to 30 men, women, and children, and this becomes known as the Ludlow Massacre, that strike failing. Union struggles put free speech at the center of progressive form as well. Courts rejected unions' claims that they're exercising their First Amendment rights to assemble, and labor struggles create a demand for civil liberties that become very critical later in the 20th century. Workers in company towns in particular that are dominated by an employer were not free to speak out without potentially being fired or worse. And the IWW plays a role in a series of free speech fights as a means for organizing unions in the West. Many IWW workers are arrested and jailed for speaking in public. The union would send hundreds and thousands more members to speak, forcing local governments to arrest them all and flood the jails. Eventually, local officials would become overwhelmed and would allow the Wobblies to speak. Various other varieties of progressivism began to appear. The word feminism first became a widely used word in the progressive era. In 1914, a mass meeting in New York was called to debate the question, what is feminism? It was organized by a group called Heterodoxy, a women's club in Greenwich Village. The club was part of a new kind of radical bohemia in Greenwich Village, and Emma Goldman was one of its leaders. It's a social circle, really, that rejected conventional social values and practices, and there were increasing calls for the vote for women, greater economic opportunity, and open discussion of questions of sexuality. Here you can see some of the topics that are discussed by Emma Goldman as part of this Heterodoxy club. Greenwich Village was one of the centers of this so-called lyrical left in Bohemia, which took shape. Bohemia is actually a province inside of what is now the Czech Republic, the area around the city of Prague, but it comes to have a meaning for this lyrical left in the progressive era. A part of a city that's filled with what will later be called counterculture types. And that definitely begins to appear in some of the larger cities at this time. Isadora Duncan is a figure in this movement. She's pictured here. She pioneers a new expressive kind of dance, which becomes a symbol of the era. In 1913, the New York Armory Show of painting introduces Cubist paintings by European artists like Pablo Picasso to America for the first time. Freedom is central to the lyrical left's vision of society, but their individual notion of freedom is quite different from other progressives' interests in order and efficiency. Sexual freedom came alive during this period. Sigmund Freud, for example, lectured in America in 1909 and found that Americans were familiar with some of his theories about infantile sexuality, repression, and the irrational. Free sexual expression and reproductive choice become critical elements of the women's liberation movement. And new sexual attitudes spread beyond Bohemia to many young, unmarried, and independent women. Also, the new tolerance for sexual freedom begins to draw gay people to Greenwich Village for the first time. The birth control movement is part of this as well. The women's growing presence in the labor market strengthened demands for birth control, giving political expression to changes in their sexual behavior. In the 19th century, the right to control one's body meant the ability to refuse sexual advances, including those of a husband, but now it means enjoying an active sexual life without necessarily bearing children. Emma Goldman writes on this issue and regularly lectures on the right to birth control and various contraceptive devices. Many women get arrested for speaking out on that particular issue. Margaret Sanger emerges as a major advocate for this, and she places birth control at the center of the new feminism that's emerging. By 1914, after facing censorship from the U.S. Post Office for writing about how to use birth control, she openly advertises birth control devices in her own journal, the Woman Rebel. She opens up storefronts in working class areas, clinics that help give contraceptive devices to poor immigrant women. She ends up being thrown in jail for a month for this. Labor radicals, cultural modernists, and not just feminists promote Sanger and the birth control movement. Eventually, her society will lead to groups like Planned Parenthood. American Indians are also influenced by the progressive movement and share that progressive impulse. The Society of American Indians is founded in 1911, and it's a typical progressive era reform organization. It unites Indian intellectuals around the discussion of Native American problems and tries to arouse public awareness. It brings Indians together from many different backgrounds and creates a pan-Indian public space free from white influence. Many in the society share the basic goals of federal Indian policy that were basically we described in the Dawes Act. The group's founder is Carlos Montezuma. He becomes an avowed critic and condemns government paternalism and demands the abolition of the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He calls for self-determination and for Indians to be granted full citizenship. Keep in mind that at this time, Native Americans aren't even considered American citizens. Progressive politics becomes a worldwide movement. In the early 20th century, cities all around the world experience similar problems that are caused by industrialization and massive growth. In 1850, only 2 cities, London and Paris, had a population of more than 1 million. By 1900, there were 12 cities over 1 million in Europe and the United States, including New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Reformers around the world begin to exchange ideas and propose new social policies to deal with some of the problems of this urban growth. Britain, France, and Germany create so-called social legislation, old age pensions for the elderly, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, and regulation of workplace safety. American reformers also start to advocate that social legislation. They call for an activist, socially conscious government. Most of the reform of the progressive period occurs at the state and local level and gradually works its way up from the grassroots to the federal government. Again, the desire is to reduce the power of the political bosses over urban political machines, to take control over natural monopolies like utility companies, to raise property taxes to pay for social services. Robert La Follette, who's pictured here and whose nickname is Fightin' Bob, eventually emerges as the major progressive leader and the governor of Wisconsin. Wisconsin becomes kind of a laboratory for democracy at the time and becomes one of the leading states in the progressive movement. The so-called Wisconsin idea calls for primary elections in which the people have a choice in deciding who a party runs, rather than the decision being made by party bosses in a smoke-filled room, as it had been done in the past. They call for a tax on corporate wealth and state regulation of railroads and utilities. Various progressive devices are used to try and increase the voice of the people. The initiative, where the people themselves can propose laws. The referendum, where people vote on law or a state constitutional amendment. And the recall, where the people in a special election can recall a public official for malfeasance in office or corruption. Increasingly, nonpartisan commissions start to run cities, and the movement away from machine politics and city bosses begins to gather force. Various forms of city government are put into place, including government by professionals and city managers. One of the ideas of the progressives is that government should be by experts, people who are specially trained in social services and who will be less subjected to political pressures from the political machines. Walter Lippmann is a leading intellectual and a voice of some of these ideas of the progressive era. Most progressives are very leery of real-world politics in which people pursue kind of narrow class, ethnic, or regional interests, and they turn to college professors and other experts, believing that the government could ensure intelligent rule over society by a democracy run by these impartial experts. In Drift and Mastery, Walter Lippmann sets out some of these ideas. He argues that the nation continues to drift, operating according to a dated belief in individual autonomy or individual rights. And he calls for mastery, a movement towards scientific inquiry to address modern social problems. For Lippmann and others, political freedom doesn't necessarily rest in direct political participation, but in the formation of public policy by the most qualified. Because of this, sometimes the progressives are labeled as kind of elitist. They think they know better what to do for society and are sometimes criticized as being social engineers. Progressivism also contains a more democratic vision of activist government, perhaps best expressed by various women reformers. They're still unable to vote and hold office in most states, but women become central in progressive politics. They challenge barriers to political participation, and they elaborate a grassroots democratic vision of government. They were moved to act most often by the conditions faced by poor immigrant communities in the cities, and particularly women and child workers. Jane Addams is a typical of this era and the kind of new woman reformer that emerges. She sets up a Hull House in an ethnic neighborhood in Chicago in 1889. It provides social services to the poor that the government does not provide at this point: nursing, education, second language classes for foreign speakers, and often meals and other types of social work. The settlement house movement, which the Hull House is an example of, spreads to other cities and becomes kind of a spearhead for reform at the local level. Various settlement houses all around the country produce prominent progressive leaders like Julia Lathrop, the first woman to head a federal agency, the Children's Bureau, founded in 1912. It investigated conditions of mothers and children and advocated for them. Also, Florence Kelley, who organized the National Consumers League to use purchasing power as a way to force manufacturers to improve working conditions. Some of the progressive influence, though, involves what is called maternalist reform. Maternalist reforms are based on the assumption that women need extra help more than men. And many states begin to enact pensions for mothers to enable them to care for children. The maternalist reforms are based on the assumption that government should encourage women's ability to bear and raise children and allow them to be economically independent. Other progressive laws recognize that women work outside the home, but define them as a dependent group, kind of like children that needed state protection in ways that male workers did not. In a landmark case, Muller versus Oregon, decided in 1908, the U.S. court accepted the arguments of Louis Brandeis that long hours of labor are dangerous for women. It could damage their childbearing abilities, and that required a government protection. This is the first major breach of the liberty of contract doctrine. But again, the cost of the Mueller decision is high. Even more states begin to pass protective laws for women workers, but these laws, again, reinforce gender discrimination and exclusion in the labor markets. The government began to regulate working conditions, but that does, again, raise the question of liberty of contract. But again, gender inequality is kind of built into the system in the early foundations of an emerging welfare state. The progressive movement ends up percolating up to the federal level, and various amendments are added to the Constitution that have a progressive impulse behind them. The 16th Amendment provides for a federal income tax. Income taxes had not been allowable until this point in the 16th Amendment. It's seen as a way to redistribute wealth and provide social services to society. It's definitely a progressive impulse, and we saw that with the populists as well, the call for a graduated income tax where the wealthy pay a greater percentage of their wealth than the poor do. The 17th Amendment calls for the direct election of senators. Again, the state legislatures are notoriously corrupt. This had been called for, by the way, by the populists, as we've talked about. And senators were, again, directly elected by the people, as they are today. The original Constitution had them being elected by the state legislatures or chosen by them, and that had basically packed the Senate with the supporters of big business and trusts, often not acting in what the progressives viewed as the best interests of society. The 18th Amendment also is the culmination of the long-standing temperance movement to ban the consumption of alcohol. This definitely has a social dimension for progressives, and particularly progressive women who saw alcoholism as one of the major causes for domestic abuse and poverty, as husbands drank up their weekly paycheck at taverns. Prohibition culminates again with the 18th Amendment. It has unintended consequences, as we will see in the 1920s. The 19th Amendment is also part of this progressive impulse. It becomes a mass movement in the progressive era for the first time. The National American Women's Suffrage Association's membership grows enormously, and its campaign has some success in the states. It wins women's suffrage in many of the western states: Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah. In between 1910 and 1914, 7 more western states give women the right to vote. These campaigns are conducted with a new spirit of militancy and use modern methods of advertising, publicity, and other entertainment characteristics of a mass society. Increasingly, the focus comes on a national constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote, and it's finally ratified by the requisite number of states, and based upon the wording of the 15th Amendment, which had, as you recall, said that you could not take away someone's right to vote because of race. The 19th Amendment says you can't take away someone's right to vote because of sex. This map shows the extent of women's suffrage before the 19th Amendment. The states in purple already had complete voting rights for women, With the passage of the 19th Amendment, the rest of the states, including the states in brown, which had no voting rights for women, now are required to allow women to vote. The first presidential election in which women nationwide vote is the 1920 election. Let's turn to the progressive presidents. Teddy Roosevelt is the first of these, and as we talked about in the Gilded Age lecture, the presidents of the after the Civil War tended to be a rather kind of colorless and weak lot. Teddy Roosevelt definitely turns that around. As you recall, he had been a war hero in the Spanish-American War and was put on the ticket for William McKinley's re-election in 1900. William McKinley is assassinated, becoming the third president to be assassinated. He's killed by an anarchist new immigrant, and that brings Teddy Roosevelt to office as the youngest president in American history to that point. Roosevelt quickly becomes a different kind of president. He believed that the president should help settle labor disputes and act as a neutral third party, not simply act in favor of business as previous presidents had done. He begins a campaign of trust busting, of trying to break up some of the large trusts that he feels have abused their economic power and have exploited smaller producers in the economy. The Northern Securities Company is an example of this. He has his Justice Department bring a lawsuit to break up this large trust that controls the railway industry in the United States, particularly the Pacific Northwest. The Elkins Act of 1903 begins to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, and after Roosevelt's re-election in 1904, the Hepburn Act provides for more direct economic regulations of interstate commerce and reinforces the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Supreme Court had restricted its powers, and now Congress begins to expand it. The Hepburn Act gives the ICC the power to set railroad rates, and an important step in giving the federal government regulatory power over the railroads. Roosevelt's administration also sees the passage of the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Again, direct results of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. All kinds of things were ending up in drugs. Check out this advertisement for cocaine toothache drops. In fact, one of the major ingredients in Coca-Cola initially was cocaine. Roosevelt steps in the anthracite coal strike in 1902, which paralyzed the coal industry. Instead of calling out federal troops to break up the strike, as previous presidents had done, he brings union leaders and managers to the White House and settles the strike by appointing a commission, the federal government acting as a kind of a neutral arbitrator between labor and capital. Roosevelt calls this approach the square deal. The square deal, again, an active federal government that regulates trusts and acts with neutrality between labor and management. Roosevelt seeks the presidency in his own right in 1904. and wins a decisive victory, a mandate basically to continue his policies. A major victory with 56% of the popular vote. Roosevelt is an avid outdoorsman. Under his leadership, the United States began to lead the world in conserving wilderness areas. It had already established the first national park in Yellowstone in 1872, but it had no national conservation policy until Roosevelt's administration. He ordered that millions of acres be set aside as wildlife preserves and urged the creation of new national parks. Conservation was typically progressive in some ways. Experts would help guide the government and to serve the public good and prevent special interests from damaging the environment. Conservation also served efficiency and control, key ideas of the progressives. The beauty of Yosemite, for example, is set aside in a national park under Roosevelt's leadership. Gifford Pinchot is an example of the kind of expert that should lead the economy, lead the oversight of public lands. He's put in charge of the U.S. Forest Service. Roosevelt triples the number and acreage of national forests and supports the creation again of the U.S. Forest Service. The chief forester believes in scientific management and the prevention of overuse of the nation's woodlands. Roosevelt has some of his reforms disrupted by the Panic of 1907. He had to begin to compromise some of his views in the face of another economic crisis. The boom and bust cycle in the American economy continued. Roosevelt announced that he would not seek a second term. Instead, he basically anoints his own successor to run for president in 1908. William Howard Taft. Taft had been the former governor of the Philippines and a federal judge from Ohio. In the election of 1908, here you see Roosevelt kind of handing off his baby, his policies to Taft. Taft is a progressive, and he believed government should go beyond the laissez-faire principles of the 19th century. He pursues antitrust even more aggressively than Roosevelt. The 1908 election here is also a major victory for the Republicans and the progressive wing of the Republican Party. The Mann-Elkins Act is put in place in June of 1910. It further strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission. Oklahoma votes for the first time in the election of 1908. Mann-Elkins allows the ICC to suspend railroad rates for 10 months if they're viewed to be unfair, pending a investigation. It allows the Interstate Commerce Commission to sue railroads in court without waiting for the Attorney General, and it extends the jurisdiction of the Interstate Commerce Commission to include telephone and telegraph companies. Eventually, though, there is a rift between Taft and Roosevelt, mainly over the issue of the tariff. Republicans tended to support a higher protectionist tariff, and Taft supported that as well. He began to ally himself more and more with the conservative wing of the Republican Party, and that eventually leads to a political break between Taft and Roosevelt, former political allies. The Payne-Aldrich Tariff, again, is one of the reasons for that. Also, Taft fires Roosevelt's the chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, that Roosevelt had appointed, and this creates a scandal and public criticisms of Taft by Roosevelt. Taft was sympathetic to reform, but again began to gravitate more towards the conservative side, more than Roosevelt cared to like. All of the tendencies in progressive thought really manifest themselves in the election of 1912, another really crucial election in American history, and a four-way contest that showed all the different types of approaches to dealing with the problems of big business and the economy. Taft re-ran and tried to seek a second term as the Republican nominee. The divisions within the Republican Party leads Teddy Roosevelt to enter the fray again and become a third-party candidate. Woodrow Wilson, another progressive who we'll talk more about in a bit, is the Democratic nominee. And then the socialist Eugene Debs enters the contest as well. They all take a different position in what becomes really a national debate on the relationship between political and economic freedom. And there is definitely a difference of opinion among them. Taft becomes the most conservative of the candidates. He argues that economic individualism could still be the basis of society if business and government work together to solve social ills. Eugene Debs stood at the opposite end of the political spectrum from Taft. Most Americans don't support the socialist revolutionary goals or their proposals for public ownership of railroads and banks, but unemployment assistance, laws limiting working hours and setting minimum wages were typically progressive calls. Most of the fight is between Roosevelt and Wilson over the federal government's role in the economy, and that's what really captivates voters in 1912. Both Wilson and Roosevelt believe that government is necessary to preserve individual freedom. They disagree about the dangers of increasing government power. Teddy Roosevelt's policy is known as the New Nationalism. He basically accepts bigness and the need for strong government regulation to check abuses of big business. Roosevelt proposes heavy personal and corporate taxes and federal regulation of industries like rail, mining, and oil. His Progressive Party, or Bull Moose Party as it comes to be called, adopts a platform with many other progressive reforms as well. Women's suffrage, an 8-hour day, living wage for workers, a national system of social insurance that would cover medical care, unemployment, and old age. This program contained a lot of the agenda that would come to define liberalism in the 20th century. The National Progressive Republican League had initially tried to nominate the progressive governor of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, as its candidate. He had to withdraw because of illness, and eventually Roosevelt becomes the Progressive Party's nominee. Again, we have Eugene V. Debs as the socialist candidate, and we've encountered him as a major labor organizer and the socialist spokesman in this period. The Bull Moose Party is the other name for the Progressive Party, and it comes from a statement made by Roosevelt. When asked about his health, he said he was as healthy as a bull moose, and that name basically stuck. The Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is also a progressive. He had been governor of New Jersey, and it helped create a workman's compensation system and state regulation of utilities and railroads there. He's also a professor and had been president of Princeton University. He's very much influenced by Louis Brandeis. He argues that government has to be independent of big business and restore market competition without creating a big government. His program ends up being called the New Freedom, and it involves strengthening antitrust, protecting workers' rights to organize unions, and encouraging a small business. Wilson hoped to recreate the conditions of real economic competition without increasing government regulation of the economy. To Roosevelt and his supporters, Wilson's program seemed outdated. It focused on small business, ignored the inevitable concentration and the interests of professionals, consumers, and labor. The results are very interesting. This political cartoon kind of sums it up. You've got the Republican elephant here divided by the Bull Moose Party, which equals a victory for the Democrats on their donkey here. You can see the extent of Wilson's electoral victory here on the map. He wins 82% of the electoral vote, but again, he doesn't get a majority of the popular vote. Notice on the popular vote, the minor candidate is 7.5%, mainly the socialist Debs, and with Roosevelt at 27.5%. Only 23% of the electorate opts for the conservative Republican option of Howard Taft, and Roosevelt basically overcomes Taft in the popular vote. The first time that had happened for a sitting Republican president, in one of the strongest third-party showings in American history. But again, not enough to overcome Wilson's advantage in the Electoral College. New Mexico and Arizona vote in this presidential election for the first time and really complete the admission of the lower 48 states into the Union. Woodrow Wilson comes to power with a resounding victory. The split in the Republican Party had basically paved the way for that. Wilson becomes a strong president. He regularly deals with Congress regarding legislation. He's the first president to hold regular press conferences. He's the first president to deliver messages personally to Congress, including the State of the Union address. Democrats control Congress, so Wilson is able to implement his particular progressive vision. He passes a whole series of legislation in his first 2 years of office, he and the Democratic Congress. The Clayton Antitrust Act is passed, which exempts unions from antitrust laws, overturning the use of federal court injunctions against limiting workers' rights to strike. The Federal Trade Commission Act is also passed, which sets up the FTC and is designed to ban unfair labor practices by businesses focusing on advertising and false advertising and so forth. There is a major overhaul of the nation's banking system with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It decentralizes banks into regional banks, and this system is still basically in place. with the Federal Reserve Board overseeing interest rates that are charged to other banks for money. This had been one of the key demands of the populists, a more localized banking system that will take into account the needs of rural areas of America as well as the needs of Wall Street. The Underwood Tariff is passed in 1913. It basically reduces tariff duties on imports, but made up for them with a graduated income tax on the wealthy. That income tax was struck down by the Supreme Court, and as a result, the 16th Amendment, allowing for income taxes, is added to the Constitution. The Federal Farm Loan Act is passed by Congress in 1916 and goes a long way towards implementing that sub-treasury plan that the populists had called for, basically trying to make credit more easily available to farmers and restructuring the loans that they pay back. Congress also passes the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act in 1916. It attempts to ban child labor by prohibiting the shipping and interstate commerce of any good produced with the labor of a child. The Supreme Court strikes that act down, and child labor doesn't end up being banned at the federal level until the 1930s, as we're going to see. The Adamson Act is also passed. It provides for the 8-hour day for workers in railroads and for miners, two of the areas that are very crucial to the industrial economy and most susceptible to agitation by the Wobblies, or the industrial workers of the world. There's a real flurry of legislation in Woodrow Wilson's first term before the country becomes increasingly distracted by events in Europe and the beginnings of the Great War, or World War I. America will eventually be drawn into that conflict, and that story we will take up in our next audio slideshow. Thank you, and I hope you're enjoying the course.